everybody, and welcome to the first session of the conference, or at least of this day of the conference. It seems appropriate that we should begin the Catholic Imagination Conference with the Catholic poet Dante. And so we're very happy to have with us three Danteisti who are going to talk with us about Dante in very different ways. So I'm going to go ahead with the introductions so that we can go ahead and start the panel. My name, by the way, is Angela Alaimo O'Donnell. I'm the Associate Director of the Kern Center for American Catholic Studies at Fordham University in New York City. And I am joined by my colleagues to the left. Our first presenter is going to be Catherine Wolff. And Catherine, as many of you know, because I know she brought her entourage with her today, which is great. Catherine graduated from UC Berkeley in 1973. She received an MA in art history from the University of Michigan and taught high school before earning her MSW from Syracuse University. She worked for many years as a therapist before returning to California, where she served as director of the Arrupe Center for Community-Based Learning at Santa Clara University from 1999 to 2005. From 2006 to 2009, she was director of the Faith Formation at the Catholic Community at Stanford, during which time she earned her MA in Pastoral Ministries at Santa Clara University. She's the editor of Not Less Than Everything, Catholic Writers on Heroes of Conscience, from Joan of Arc to Oscar Romero, which if you don't have that book, you should get it, because it's really quite wonderful, and has recently completed a book on the afterlife, Great Expectations, to be published by Riverhead Books. She lives in Northern California with her husband, Tobias Wolff, and close to their 3 children and 3 grandchildren. And today, Catherine will be speaking about Dante and the afterlife. Our second speaker today is Griffin Oleynick. Did I say it correctly? Oleynick, my apologies. He is an assistant editor at Commonweal, having arrived in January 2018 as the magazine's first John Garvey Writing Fellow. He joined the staff in May. Griffin graduated from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, with a bachelor's in industrial and labor relations, and then earned a PhD in Italian language and literature from Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. And today, Griffin is going to be speaking about Dante in a time of crisis, the idea of poverty in the Inferno. And last, but by no means least, Paul Contino is going to speak with us today about Dante. And unfortunately, Paul's bio is not in the book, so I'm going to read it from my phone because he sent it to me. Paul Contino has taught in the Great Books Colloquium at Pepperdine University since 2002. Before that, he taught at Christ College, the Honors College of Valparaiso University. For 11 years, he and his wife, Mary, served as co-editors of Christianity and Literature. He wrote the introduction to Burton Raffles' translation of the Divine Comedy, and his essay on Dante and theology is forthcoming in the MLA Guide to Teaching the Divine Comedy. He's published essays on an array of writers: Zwangazi, Jane Austen, Michal Bakhtin, Arthur Miller, Czesław Miłosz, Geoffrey Hill, Andre Dubus, and Alice McDermott, a very wide range of interesting writers. His Commonweal profile of Tobias Wolff won a Catholic Press Association award. His reviews have appeared in America, First Things, and The Christian Century, and his essay on Roman Catholicism is included in the Cambridge Companion to Literature and Religion. Currently, he is completing a book on the incarnational realism of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. And today, Paul will be talking about Dante and the meaning of suffering. So please join me in welcoming to the podium our first speaker, Catherine Wolff.
Good morning. As Angela said, I just finished a book on the afterlife. And in my research, I found that in most religions, there are tales of other world travelers, people who have gone to the afterlife and come back and told us what they found. And now in Western Christianity, we all know of Dante's account in the Divine Comedy, but he's actually part of a long and distinguished tradition. And so I'm going to tell you some of the stories of these other world travelers that preceded him. Mind you, there are several that came after him, but he actually is the best. Their earliest recorded journey, that of Enkidu, is about 5,000 years old. Enkidu was Gilgamesh's boon companion, and together they roamed a universe of 3 realms: the heaven of the gods, the earth of humans, and the underworld. As Enkidu lies dying, he dreams of the house of dust, from which there is no return. There he finds priests of purification, priests of ecstasy, the queen of the netherworld, and other gods. The human inhabitants wear garments of feathers, live in darkness, drink dirt, and eat clay. All around are heaps of royal crowns of mighty rulers who now have to wait on the gods. Enkidu eventually dies and becomes a ghost in this gloomy underworld, which looking forward in time is rather similar to the Jewish Gehenna or to the Hades of Odysseus. A more complete and hopeful account is that of the righteous Viraz from the Zoroastrian tradition. Viraz is elected by priests to test the truth of their faith, taking a 7-day trip beyond. His soul leaves his body and is met by divine guides who take him to the bridge of the requiter. Viraz is a good man, so it grows wide to accommodate him, and after he crosses, his deeds are weighed in a golden balance. Viraz visits a purgatory where people undergo alternating waves of heat and cold while they await resurrection, and then goes on to heaven, which has 3 levels. The stars, where those who had good thoughts dwell, the moon for those who spoke good words, and the sun for those who did good deeds. The 4th level of heaven is the realm of endless light, that of Ahura Mazda. There, good souls enjoy themselves in a heavenly garden. Men who killed lots of reptiles, and women who satisfied their husbands and were submissive and obedient to them. Viraz goes to hell, too, through 4 progressively more awful underground levels with horrid smells and hideous punishments for particular sins, such as being eaten by demons for not wearing a sacred girdle, and this is for women, for licking a red-hot oven, for being sharp-tongued, or wearing makeup. Viraz's journey concludes with another audience with Ahura Mazda, in which the deity manifests as pure light. As our stories continue, you'll find that several of the features of Viraz's account recur in tales of the afterlife. Good and bad realms, a perilous bridge to cross, testing and judgment, and a God described in terms of light. In the Jewish tradition, Ezekiel travels to heaven in a vision and beholds the Lord, a dazzling enthroned figure above the firmament. Just like the appearance of the rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the appearance of brilliance that surrounded him. Ezekiel also beholds the fiery chariot of God in a vision that has inspired Jewish mystics to rise like Ezekiel into God's realm. In later, Ezekiel gives an excruciatingly detailed, and I mean that, account of heaven, a magnificent structure on a high mountain through which flows a life-giving river, teeming with every kind of creature, and along its banks grow every kind of fruit tree that continually bear fresh fruit. Enoch is my favorite, first mentioned in Genesis as walking with God, is an inveterate otherworld traveler. His story was told in many different versions and languages that span 300 years before and 200 years after Christ. In addition, he appears in the Gnostic version of the universe, in the apocryphal vision of Paul, in the 13th century heaven of Mechtild of Magdeburg, and much later he visits Joseph Smith. Enoch's journey starts with a dream in which he is actually called by clouds and mists, then blown by winds along a path of stars up to the heavenly temple of Jerusalem, built of white marble with burning gates, floors of crystal, and a ceiling like a path of stars. As with other such travelers, he's tested. He reaches a wall built of hailstones surrounded by a tongue of fire, and he faints in fear. But then he has a vision within a vision, and it brings him to an immense house of burning marble where he sees God face to face. Archangels then escort Enoch through the cosmos where he sees storehouses of stars, storms, winds, and the pillars of heaven. He witnesses the punishment of rebel angels in the abyss, in the place where the souls of the dead reside until the day of great judgment. Later, Enoch became Metatron, a powerful new angel. His flesh is turned to flame, his veins to fire, his eyeballs to flaming torches. God seats him on a throne and reveals heavenly secrets. Metatron then leads us on a tour of the heavenly family of angels, and we see various fates for souls. The good souls fly around the throne of glory. Bad souls are permanently stained, black like the bottom of pots, and they're incapable of being cleansed, and they're damned for eternity. Cut forward to 1st century AD, we have John the Revelator, the Christian, which his journeys also took him beyond space and time. God appears in human form in Revelations on a jewel-crusted throne, guarded by spirits with 6 wings and many eyes. 24 elders in white garments and golden crowns worship him with lightning, thunder, and unceasing song. These heavens are very busy, it seems. There ensues the cosmic drama of the end times and a final judgment. But eventually a new heaven and a new earth come to pass, and a magnificent new Jerusalem is established. As in Ezekiel, a life-giving river flows from the throne of God down through the middle of its main thoroughfare, which is lined by the tree of life, whose leaves are the medicine of the nations. The Lord himself is its temple and its light, and only those in the book of life will be allowed to enter. Some 500 years later, Muhammad traveled to the afterworld in his mirage or ascension. Having made the night journey to Jerusalem, he ties up his steed Barak to the Wailing Wall and ascends a ladder of 7 layers of silk, floating up towards the moon and the stars. Guided by the angel Gabriel, he tours 7 levels of hell, where people, some of whom he recognizes, are being tortured for their sins. He travels through the 8 tiers of heaven, meeting successively more important prophets and angels, Adam, Jesus, Abraham, and through prayers and testing they become brother prophets. In the highest heaven he encounters God, who is so brilliant that Muhammad cannot see him and has to communicate through Gabriel. Another world traveler, guided by holy personages, touring successively bad and good realms, where souls suffer or rejoice based on their bad or good deeds, meeting the very center of it all, a divinity described in terms of brilliant light, returning to enlighten us with his story. These are familiar elements by now, and we find them in Dante's work. There may be more than a common human intuition here, though, because in Dante's time, Arabic culture was well known in Tuscany, and indeed there was a version of Muhammad's Mirage in a manuscript called Liber Scale, Macomete, that would be the Book of the Ladder. And this was widely translated, and so it's quite likely, actually, that Dante would have been very familiar with it. Indeed, by Dante's time, tales of other Christian travelers were also in wide circulation. A 12th century account tells of a knight named Owen, who descended into St. Patrick's Purgatory in Contino to do penance for his sins. He is guided by a demon. When he reaches hell, where bodies shoot up and down in flames, the demons throw him in. Owen is saved when he remembers to call on Jesus. He is then taken to a river of fire and forced to cross a bridge that is impossibly slippery, narrow, and high. But as he goes, it widens, for he has been cleansed of his sins. Remember Barabbas and his bridge. At last he comes to a dazzling pastoral land where purified souls await God's call to heaven. You can still go to St. Patrick's Purgatory. It is still there in County Donegal. Not sure how far in you can go. Mechtilde Magdeburg wrote of her journey to heaven in the flowing light of the Godhead. There she found 3 levels of heaven, a paradise of garden, which is where she walks with Enoch, and that's for souls who weren't bad enough for purgatory nor good enough for heaven. The next level is a great dome full of angel choirs, where at final judgment the blessed will take their places according to their merit. God lives in the 3rd heaven, and this is where Mechtilde's account becomes deeply personal. Whereas all the blessed enjoy the beatific vision of God, she, as a holy virgin woman, is allowed to visit Christ's bridal chamber to have intimate union with him. In the guise of a noble lady, she yields to Christ, who appears as a beautiful youth. Thus comes to pass what both of them desire. He gives himself to her, and she herself to him. They have become spiritual lovers, the very consummation of her soul's desire. Christian mystical travel reaches its apogee in the Divine Comedy, although Dante drew on classical sources as well, Aeneas's travels in the afterlife, and Ptolemy's model of the universe, which is concentric spheres beyond which lies God's world. Dante writes from a specific place and time, 1330, as an everyman figure with a mission to tell us what he finds on his travels. Though he must include pain and suffering, he tells us he will also find love, God's love that in the beginning set all the beauty of the universe in motion. We know the story. He is rescued from his moral wandering by his childhood love, Beatrice, and guided by Virgil through the circles of hell, down to its dead center where Satan is fixed in a frozen lake. They pass through the 7 terraces of purgatory, where those guilty of one of the 7 sins are suffering appropriate punishments, such as those who were envious having their eyes sewn shut with iron wire. Virgil cannot travel beyond purgatory, as he was born before Christ and therefore is not saved. Dante goes on to a lush earthly paradise and is cleansed of his sins and restored to the memory of his virtues. Beatrice comes to guide him the rest of the way, and they leap up into the stars. The cosmos is suffused with the ultimate light of God and the cosmic harmony of the spheres. And Beatrice and Dante together are love, drawn towards its source. They travel through the spheres, meeting souls along the way who are saved according to their own potential for love and joy, and the brilliance of God intensifies as they go. The travelers come to a golden ladder that astonishes Dante. It was as if all the stars in heaven were pouring down it. They continue their ascent to the realm of the church triumphant, where Dante realizes that Beatrice's brilliance has become that of Christ, and his eyes are too weak to bear it. When Christ and Mary descend to welcome them, even words fail Dante. In order to represent or image the highest heavens, the sacred poem must leap a gap, like the one who finds the road washed out before him. He is tested by Peter, James, and John on faith, hope, and love, and he is inspired by the Holy Spirit to declare that his sacred poem has been wrought by both heaven and earth. Beatrice restores his sight, and they move at last to the final sphere of the universe, the prima mobile of what moved directly by God, where dwell 9 choirs of angels. It is enclosed not by something physical, but by light and love. And from there, Dante can look to the final world, the Empyrean, which has no time, nor space, nor physical being. There he encounters a river of light, divine grace, alive with angelic sparks, flowing with banks blooming with faithful souls. Drinking of these waters, he cries, I saw, I saw, I saw, an entreaty for strength to convey what he has seen, a circle of light emanating from God. Circular rows of seats for the blessed arise in the shape of a heavenly rose. Dante turns to Beatrice, but she has taken her place in the 3rd tier of heaven, just below Adam and Moses and Peter. She smiles on him, and then she turns back to the light. Bernard of Clairvaux is now his guide, and he invites Dante to look up through the rose to Mary and to God, so far as the divine glory permits. The sight and understanding Dante has earned enables him to enter into the light. Overflowing grace through which I could presume to fix my gaze on the eternal light so fully that I used up all my sight. Dante, the pilgrim poet, returns from his visionary journey to tell his story to us. 700 years on, its images reappear and its message of hope still resonates. T.S. Eliot was guided by Dante when he concluded his 4 quartets with Julian of Norwich's assurance that all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, in a heaven where the tongues of flames are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. Thank you.
So I'm afraid my presentation will be a bit more granular and in the weeds, but hopefully enjoyable. So it wasn't until I began working as a digital editor at Commonweal magazine that I'd ever had any exposure to that fractious online forum that goes by the affectionate nickname of Catholic Twitter. I'd spent most of the past decade toiling in the contentious field of Dante studies, where the poet's every line, and often individual words, could generate heated arguments that were, if you'll permit me, neither divine nor comedies. That is, in the strict Aristotelian sense, they didn't have happy endings. But the level of vitriol that could occasionally emerge from academic jousts of unrivaled Danteisti pales in comparison to today's online fights between fellow Catholics, supposedly united in their love of a common Lord. It's not just the daily ad hominem attacks and casual accusations of cafeteria Catholicism, doctrinal heresy, and schismatic tendencies that I find so distasteful and counterproductive. It's the cynical, competitive spirit that undergirds so much of the online discourse, obsessed as it is with scoring points, winning likes, and gaining followers. In a time of serious crisis in the Church, when we Catholics are called to recover what Pope Francis insists on calling the joy of the gospel, this increasingly vocal Church without Christ serves only to intensify tensions and reinforce divisions. How, facing such an impoverishment of the Catholic imagination, are we to find our way out of the wilderness? I want to suggest that we can turn to Dante, a poet who knows better than anyone both the savage acrimony of partisan politics, as well as the necessity of finding a suitable guide for making one's way out. American Dante scholar Giuseppe Mazzotta, playing on the title of Eric Auerbach's classic study Dante, Poet of the Secular World, once called Dante the poet of the desert, thereby underscoring the biblical perspective of exile that both informs the structure of the Divine Comedy and constitutes the core of the poet's visionary spirituality. Taking one step further, we might also call Dante the poet of poverty, acquainted as he was with both the humiliating shame, but also the freeing possibilities of a life lived without significant power or material resources. And he really insists on the veracity of his poverty. You remember in Paradiso 15, where his ancestor Cacciaguida, prophesying his future exile, tells him how painful it will be to climb the stairs owned by others and to eat others' bread. It will be salty. Dante's poverty, it must be stressed, was not strictly imaginary. He'd actually lost his post in Florence's Republican government, where he was both a consul and a leading diplomat, as well as his estate outside the city walls, not only his home, but his only source of income. Stripped of Florentine citizenship on trumped-up charges of barratry, the buying and selling of political office, Dante spent the last 2 decades of his life on the road, wandering about the aristocratic courts of northern Italy in search of patronage. And this is really where his identity as a pilgrim, as a peregrine, as somebody who's outside of social and institutional structures comes from. And he mentions close to his death that he was so poor that he didn't have the money to buy decent clothes to attend a friend's funeral, in one of his letters. If Dante's personal and political life collapsed as a result of his exile in the early 1300s, so too did many of the institutional structures of the late medieval world to which he belonged. For all our modern illusions of a harmonious and united medieval Christendom, let's remember that Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries was for most people a brutal, violent place. Politically, Italian cities were increasingly unstable, threatened not only by pitched ideological battles among Guelphs and Ghibellines, but also, and in large part, as a result of their growing wealth, accumulated by means of a burgeoning proto-capitalist economy. This is something Dante rightly condemns as, he calls it la gente nuova, the new people, e subiti guadagni, easy money basically, which had wrought effects on the Florentine cityscape. Not by chance, his infernal city of Dis is characterized by its proliferation of towers, the same that Dante saw in Florence, Bologna, Siena, San Gimignano, kind of now like Chicago, New York City. And the church itself was notoriously, egregiously corrupt, not just in the ranks of the ordinary clergy, but especially in the upper echelons of the hierarchy, in which shrewd canon lawyers, like Dante's archenemy Pope Boniface VIII, worked energetically to consolidate the church's temporal power. Let's not suppose that the new universities, for all the flowering of medieval scholasticism, were any better. Theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure of Bagnoregio, when they weren't preaching, praying, or teaching, found themselves locked in decades-long disputes with the secular masters at Paris, who forced them to defend the legitimacy of their mendicant orders as they pondered the question of whether Jesus Christ had ever owned material goods. That is, whether he was really, as the Gospels claim, poor. From these inquiries came all sorts of intellectual novelties, not just the social analysis of usury, but the birth of modern economic thought, most notably in the writings of a Franciscan from southern France, Pierre-Jean Olivier, who conceptualized commodities in a way that anticipated by centuries Karl Marx's distinctions between use values and exchange values. Such a renewed emphasis on poverty also rankled the heart of ecclesial power, making obvious, as Pope Francis has today, the embarrassing gap between the professed ideals of the church, that Christ was poor, and the actual lives of the hierarchy and clergy, who were not. Writing and theorizing about poverty in the 14th century was to enter a hotly charged field, one that could even result in death. And there's a Franciscanist at Penn State University named David Burr who writes a really moving introduction in his book on the spiritual Franciscans about how in the 1320s, under the condemnation of John the 22nd, several spiritual Franciscans were burned at the stake for holding that doctrinally Christ had never enjoyed the ownership of goods, only the use. To show you the lengths, the theoretical lengths that they went to kind of push away this notion of a poor Christ. No stranger to controversy, Dante seized on these debates, which reached their height during the 1310s, the same decade when he was composing the Purgatorio and Paradiso, as a way of articulating his own project of political and ecclesial reform. Dante's affinity for the Franciscans is well known. Before his banishment from Florence, he'd listened to their public lectures on philosophy and theology at Santa Croce, and his daughter even became a Franciscan nun. And there's an old legend that he was actually a Third Order Franciscan regular. There's really no hard evidence to suggest that, though he does make frequent reference to things that only Franciscans would have known, like his cord before he climbs on the back of Geryon. And he compares himself in Virgil to two friars walking alone, one in front of the other along the way, which is, of course, how mendicants used to travel. And ironically enough, he's buried in a Franciscan church at Ravenna. Scholars like Raoul Mancelli in Italy and Nick Havley in England have argued that Dante's vision in the Divine Comedy was profoundly shaped by the anti-papal apocalypticism of the so-called spiritual Franciscans, radical friars like Angelo da Clarino and Ubertino da Casale, who, reworking earlier prophecies of the Calabrian abbot Joachim of Fiore, viewed St. Francis as the second coming of Christ and the corrupt popes as, well, the Antichrist. That's true to some extent. Still, although Dante continually asserts his material poverty as a self-authorizing strategy in Purgatorio and Paradiso, he also takes care to distance himself from the spirituals, always insisting on the difference between their extremism and his orthodoxy. Dante was in every sense a radical reformer, but he was also at heart an institutionalist. His project of remaking medieval Italy took place not in the richly frescoed halls of power, but within the capacious space of his poetic imagination, what he calls his ingenio, unleashed above all amidst the verbal innovations of the Paradiso. Dante thought of himself not so much as a prophet, but first and foremost as a poet, in the Greek sense of the term poiesis, which signals the artisanal act of making, joining, combining. And you remember that the metaphor of the fabbro, the blacksmith, T.S. Eliot reminds us of it when he dedicates The Wasteland to Ezra Pound. He calls him Il Miglior Fabbro, which is what, of course, Guido Guinizelli in the Purgatorio had called Arnaud Daniel, the Provençal poet. Poetry, then, means something particular for Dante. It's more than just putting words together, though of course that's part of it. It's also an imaginative method, a style of thought, a way of placing discrete branches of human knowledge, political, philosophical, theological, historical, scientific, and literary, in conversation with each other, in order to better draw out the manifold ways in which they converge. The scholastics famously imposed a rigid order upon the entire encyclopedia of human knowledge, and in particular, the liberal arts. And if we have medievalists in the audience, they'll know that the trivium precedes the quadrivium, that it goes from grammar to rhetoric to dialectic, and then arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, of course, theology. You had to study everything else before you could study theology, the sciences. A good example of this, in addition to the text that Catherine mentioned, Bonaventure's Itinerarium in Mentis Dei, the journey of the mind into God. Dante studies this order, masters it, but then he does things with it, reshaping and rearranging it in order to evince new nodes of connection, relativizing and destabilizing what scholasticism tends to fix in place. What lies at the center of Dante's poetic method is the concept of play, which he finds in none other than the so-called Joculator Domini, God's jester, St. Francis of Assisi. The saint, himself one of the earlier poets of the Italian vernacular, in the first line of his Canticle of Creatures, in Umbrian, is famous today as the title of Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si. Francis not only gives Dante a model of ecclesial reform in the very unhierarchical fraternal structure of his order of friars minor, Francis also identifies poverty itself as the fertile ground of such play, and Dante uses what they call a hapax legomenon, right? So a word that only appears once in the entire poem, which is a ben ferace, that adjective ferace, coming from the Latin ferax, which is really applied to fields. It's something fertile, earthy, organic, and sort of recalls the idea of the natural world and creation ex nihilo. But how can poverty, literally nothing, be as generative as Dante following Francis claims? Dante answers the question with a story, told through the mouth of none other than Thomas Aquinas in Paradiso 11, also known as the Canto of St. Francis. Here, Dante gives us a long hagiography, itself playfully adapted from a plurality of rival Franciscan sources. And there's a long history, about 100 years before Dante was writing on Francis, of different factions within the Franciscan order writing different lives of Francis. So Dante had a wide range of materials from which to draw. And he takes the ones that are in conflict and he kind of fuses them into a harmonic whole. Dante's life of Francis, like everything he writes, is distinctive. He has the effusive St. Thomas tell it not as a paratactic sequence of miracles, but rather as a picaresque romance between Francis and his lover, Lady Poverty. French film critic André Bazin, writing on the Flowers of St. Francis by Roberto Rossellini in the 1950s, observed that the great Italian director's primary contribution to the mode of neorealism was to simply show how Franciscan friars run barefoot through the fields. For Bazin, these joyful bodies in motion, both immersed in and at one with the natural world, revealed a distinctly Catholic ecology of reality, and pointed the way to a Christian humanism that was capable of transcending competing post-World War II ideologies. And that's a lot like what Dante gives us in Paradiso 11, as Francis's family spontaneously grows into a broader movement, then a recognized religious order. And there's a kind of unflagging energy to the poetry of Dante's verse, where he begins with a kind of chain of things that he's caught up in, but then he starts breaking them with verbs like scalzasi Bernardo, scalzasi Egidio. So it's really got this forward motion. And it's also very effusive and tongue-in-cheek. It's ironic that he's using Thomas Aquinas, the guy who wrote the Summa, as the person who's now becoming almost a troubadour. The main point Dante wants us to understand is that St. Francis and his followers have effectively inverted the values of the world. They're not chasing after wealth or prestige or fame or power, those same things that Dante himself had been involuntarily stripped of. Instead, they're all running after nothing. But, and here's the key, then this poor, humble nothing suddenly gives birth to something, becoming the source of an unprecedented, infinitely generative freedom. One last point. In Paradiso 11, Dante also draws our attention to the fact that Francis's poverty is, to some extent, theatrically performative. A bit like in René Girard's theory of mimetic desire, Francis's scandalous public love for Lady Poverty is an image that attracts, leading others to want the same thing. Dante, similar to Giotto, was very drawn to the image of the young Francis stripping naked in front of both his father and the Bishop of Assisi in the town square. But there's a key difference. Whereas in Girard's theory, mimetic desire gives rise to violence, since two people can't possess the same thing, for Dante, the spiritual good of poverty is unlimited, since nothing is something everyone can share. That's the reason why Dante also calls poverty, paradoxically, an ignota ricchezza, that is, an unknown richness, or a richness waiting to be discovered. Though a lot of us Catholics in the United States still don't seem to get it, it's clear to me that Pope Francis does. He hasn't just called on the church to be poor and for the poor, nor does he merely have a knack for meaningful theatrics. In texts like Evangelii Gaudium, the Joy of the Gospel, the Pope tells us that the true shape of the church is not a sphere, with every point equidistant from the center, nor is it a top-down pyramid, with some points higher and others lower. Instead, the church is what he calls a polyhedron, an unruly, pluriform matrix made up of different faces. Along the edges where those different faces converge, that's where Christ and his followers are called to be. In the end of the Paradiso, of course, Dante devises a similar image, the celestial rose, where the faces of the blessed unfurl like so many petals of a flower. What it means for us, I think, is that the Catholic imagination is not just capable of tolerating or accommodating differences in cultures, languages, and theological points of view, but rather that it in fact requires such differences in order to exist, to be what it really is. Another way of saying it is that for the imagination to be Catholic, for it to be large and capacious, it needs to become small, to take an interest in what it doesn't yet know. This, Dante would say, is the kind of knowledge that poverty makes possible, where everything the mind touches, even nothing, is welcomed as a gift. Thank you.
Those are two wonderful papers, hard to follow. Not the hard to, I can follow the argument, but I mean, it's hard to follow them as a speaker. But I just am inspired to say to Griffin that the church is in good hands with people young. He looks so young. With young people like Griffin at the helm, I hope that comes out in Commonweal, which is so beautiful. The new Commonweal. The church needs to hear this. It's, green is the color of hope in Dante, and this really inspires hope. I've been lucky enough to teach Dante for 25 years at Pepperdine and before that at Valparaiso. And always I come back to the themes of grace and freedom, and I'm going to touch on suffering as well. My remarks are focused largely around teaching the work. My students come after having read St. Augustine. Let me get my watch. And they hear Augustine exhort his readers, come down so that you may ascend and make your ascent to God. In the prologue, Dante thinks he can ascend the mountain alone. Instead, he must humbly accept guidance and descend into hell so he can see sin for what it is. Only then can he ascend the terraces of purgatory and the spheres of paradise. The students and I return to a persistent theological puzzle. What's the relationship between divine grace and human freedom? We're created in the image and likeness of God. Persons have free will. This is affirmed a number of times. God's love respects human freedom, and yet all forms of Christianity, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, affirm that we're saved through God's divine and loving grace, through Christ's kenotic, salvific suffering, death, and resurrection. How does human freedom respond to this gift of grace? Does the poet's account of the pilgrim's arduous journey suggest that human effort matters more than grace, that people earn grace through meritorious work? I teach mostly Protestant students, they get very nervous. I have to remind them that the Pelagian heresy has been rejected by Augustine all the way to Pope Francis. We get that out of the way. You don't earn your way to heaven. Okay, it's a sensitive question. I've been teaching in Protestant schools for a long time. We move on. We begin to see we're free, we're not free determined, but how do a person's actions affect his or her eternal destiny? Reading the whole of the comedy over 6 weeks, students discern the perennial paradox given poetic form by Dante. Redemption is realized by humble acceptance of the gift of grace, mediated by other people, often, and by freely cooperating with the giver through love of God and neighbor. Love is at the heart of Dante's vision. Too many people think Inferno is. No, the divine love that not only moves the sun, but Dante's heart as he writes his comedy as an act of love for his fellow pilgrims. The Inferno poses a challenge to any complacent claim of God's love. How can Dante call the maker of this place of eternal pain primal love? Dante emphasizes freedom in his drama of the soul's choice, Sayre's phrase. Willfully, the souls perversely choose hell and are eager for the river crossing over the Acheron. And we'll recall 3 characters who reveal this infernal preference by their lack of love: Francesca, Farinata, and Ulysses, very briefly. Francesca's words often seduce students as much as they do Dante the Pilgrim. Reading more closely, they begin to see that she never takes responsibility for, quote, subjecting her reason for the rule of lust. She blames love, love that releases no beloved from loving, took hold of me so strongly through his beauty that, as you see, it has not left me yet. She's being blown around with her lover Paolo. Later, she blames a literary depiction of 2 lovers' illicit kiss. A Galaholt, indeed, that book, and he who wrote it. That day we read no more. So they're reading a sexy book. They fall into each other's arms. The husband walks in, kills both of them. He's punished far worse at the pit of the Inferno. But Francesca, who's in the circle of the lustful, gives an alibi which provokes a question. Do authors bear responsibility for the negative effect their words may have on readers? When Dante the Pilgrim faints, is he revealing his own love poet's guilt? Every step of the way, Dante will come to understand love more fully and more clearly. Standing erect among the heated heretics, Farinata seems magnanimous, but he too lacks love. Like Francesca, who never utters the name of her wind-blown lover, Farinata never acknowledges his sepulchral neighbor, Cavalcanti. Even when Cavalcanti cries out in grief, believing his son Guido to be dead, Farinata simply takes up where he left off. He keeps talking, and in his solipsism refuses to recognize his neighbor, much less love him. And so too Ulysses. We read his speech to the crew. Ulysses says, "You must not deny experience of what lies beyond. You were not meant to live your lives as brutes, but to be followers of worth and knowledge." And so to my students, well, isn't that why you came to college? What's wrong with this? You came to learn. You came for quest for knowledge. Why is the curious Ulysses in hell? Well, students read more closely and they begin to see that his counsel is fraudulent in its destructive curiositas. In the old days, curiosity was opposed to studiousness. Paul Griffin has a wonderful book on this. Studiousness is where you participate in the love of God by learning. Curiositas is when you're reaching vainglory because you want to be known. And Ulysses desires knowledge to grab solitary godlike power. His quest for divine omniscience and omnipotence travesties the divine attributes. He manipulates his crew through rhetoric. He severs himself from any human attachment, and students note the contrast between his journey of autonomous assertion and Dante's grace-guided pilgrimage toward conversion. After we've climbed with Dante and Virgil over the Trinitarian travesty that is the three-faced frozen Satan, we're relieved to reach the sunny shores of purgatory. Whew. I always love this. I ask students to write a postcard from purgatory. Most of them have maybe heard of this weird thing that Catholics believe. They write postcards which take the form, "Dear Mom, it's beautiful here, people are very friendly, but I'd really like to move on, so if you could spare a prayer or two." And it's wonderful. They illustrate, they have these, well, anyway, you get it. By the time we reach the 3 steps of purgatory proper, white for penitence, purple for confession, and blood red for satisfaction by penitential works, my mostly Protestant students reprise Luther's question, what's the purpose of this place? Hasn't the work been accomplished on Calvary Hill, by which we're cleansed of sin, by the red blood of the Lamb? And here, C.S. Lewis is my ace in the hole. Good, everybody's favorite Christian, including evangelical Christians. He wrote, "Our souls demand purgatory, don't they?" And compares it to going to the dentist. Gradually, students see how the poet envisions God's grace as deeply respectful of human freedom. Grace grants the soul's desire to rehabilitate itself through penitential suffering and communal prayer, until the person feels free and ready for heaven. Thus, when the souls sing the Our Father, they emphasize the free sacrifice of their will in union with Christ, whose sacrifice is definitive. Just as your angels, as they sing his praise, offer their wills to you as sacrifice, so may men offer up their wills to you. And Dante's friend Varese Donati is very explicit when he explains that his fasting, he's with the gluttonous, his hunger and thirst, is freely joined to and participates in the pain of Christ on the cross. And these are lines that I'll come back to. I speak of pain, but I should speak of solace. For we're guided to those trees. They're looking at this tree with the most luscious fruit, and they can't eat it, and they're very, very thin. We're guided to those trees by the same longing that guided Christ when he'd come to free us through the blood he shed, and in his joyousness cried out, Eli, 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 lama sabachthani, my God, why? How could that be joyous? How could he have said that in joy? Well, the graced freedom entailed in penitential offering is highlighted later in the story of Statius, who appears after the earthquake. He's described as being like Jesus on the road to Emmaus. He joins Dante and Virgil, and he explains, when some soul feels it's cleansed, so it rises. The will alone is proof of purity, and fully free, surprises soul into a change of dwelling place. I'm reminded of O'Connor, who said that purgatory is one of the most hopeful teachings of the church. I agree. Divine justice allows each person to fulfill his or her wish. Purgatory, you might call a strenuous spa experience. I sometimes, it looks like Hawaii. If you read the description, it's gorgeous. In each of these 7 terraces, the assigned vice is partly purged by invoking the countering virtue, prime exemplum of whom is Mary, the Mother of God. And here, showing paintings from Giotto, Dante's friend, is really helpful. Mary's face is the one most like her son's, and she mediates grace from the beginning of the poem. Moved by love, she appeals to Lucia, who speaks to Beatrice, who inspires Virgil to help Dante. But as they near the earthly paradise, Virgil, who most students have come to love, must make way for Beatrice. And now the students expect a dewy lovers' reunion. And if you read to the end of Purgatory, it's not. This scriptural sacramental procession, inspired by Revelation, as Catherine was talking about, ends with the jolting entrance of Admiral Beatrice, who is very harsh with Dante, just lays into him. We enact this confrontation confession scene in class, and Balthazar calls it the dynamic goal of the whole journey. And the students perceive the pilgrim has a need to weep, confess, and cleanse himself before ascending to God. Whatever their doctrinal beliefs, students can come to see Dante's Purgatory as an allegory of this life, the human inclination toward misdirected love and a deeper desire to reform through the graced habits of virtue, repentance, and prayer in both its individual and communal forms. Communal beatitude illuminates all of paradise. And as you read Dante more and more, you grow to love paradise more and more. It's at first the most forbidding, I think, but it's full of a smiling, dancing, singing silence. Practicing patience and attention, students can develop a taste for this, the bread of angels, and heaven's varied degrees of luminosity. There's another problem. Why degrees? We've come this far. You're telling me there's hierarchy in heaven? I mean, again, the egalitarianism emerges. Then they meet Picard and Donati, and like the pilgrim, they want to know. Dante asks, though you're happy here, do you desire a higher place in order to see more and be closer to him? She's in the moon, in the Ptolemaic universe. She's in the back row of the stadium, And she, of course, smiles and tells him he's seeing this the wrong way. And the answer is fully provided, at least by most of it, provided by Beatrice. She explains that all souls are united with God in the Empyrean. Their appearance in the Ptolemaic spheres is simply a command performance, all for Dante. What a guy. For the pilgrim's edification. We should all be so lucky. In fact, the point, and I think you made reference to this, Catherine, that is God, is the true center of the universe. It's not the earth, the little threshing floor. But a further answer lies in Dante's love for the diversity that is simply part of reality. Francis's image, is so beautiful there. Persons vary in their talents and gifts, the degrees to which they're receptive to grace. Some have been less receptive than others. Picarda broke her vow under duress. Falco fell in love too easily. Even in heaven, each personality remains particular. Community is both structured and diversified, but everyone smiles for the power that fashioned and foresaw. There are other questions that I raise in class but can't fully address here. For example, how does Dante the Christian respond to the reality of religious pluralism? The Eagle of Justice knows Dante's question. He asks it about the man on the Indus River, the Hindu. In all he seeks and all he does, Dante says, he's good. There's no sin within his life or speech. And that man dies unbaptized, without faith. Where is this justice then that would condemn him? Where is his sin if he doesn't believe? With this challenge, many contemporary Christians may reject Christianity, unsatisfied with the scandal of particularity that's affirmed in the eagle's response. The eagle responds, no one without belief in Christ has ever risen to this kingdom, either before or after he was crucified. Dante's answer doesn't end with that declaration. In the next canto, readers will be puzzled and delighted to discover the pagans Trajan and Ripheus shining on the eagle's eyebrow. So now, dare we hope that Virgil, whom we love, will be saved. Have you seen David Bentley Hart's new book, on universal salvation? Well, anyway, read it. Okay, so it's on this very question. That's a detour. At the end of the canto, the pair of blessed lights together, and this is the two pagans, wink in concord. They form an eyebrow. They wink. They move their flames in ways that are at one with what he said. Mandelbaum is the one who uses the wink image. And it's as if the eagle's wink is saying, God is saying to the human cry for justice, it's all right, I got this. All will be well. In Dante, God's love encompasses all. Although it wasn't until Vatican II that the Catholic Church gave the Eagles wink, a duck trial 4. What about sex? Well, students know the backstory. Dante fell and remained in love with Beatrice, even as they married other people. At the end of La Vita Nuova, he promises to write a poem worthy of her. He depicts their reunion in the comedy. But does the pilgrim experience Beatrice's beautiful presence as an idol in whom his love rests, or as an icon who reorients his love to its divine source? The pilgrim comes to see that she smiles most radiantly when Dante shifts his attention from her to Christ. The incarnation within the interrelation of the Trinity is, of course, Dante's final focus in the moment when the pilgrim becomes the poet. In an age in which eros can be held cheap, students may be surprised by the role it plays in holiness, at least in Dante's imagination. After all, Virgil entices the pilgrim to enter the flaming terrace with erotic Ovidian references, reminding him of beautiful Beatrice waiting on the other side. And her beauty only grows as the poem proceeds. In Dante's imagination, eros is not merely sublimated, but sanctified. United with agape, it yields caritas. Engaging questions like these through attention to Dante's miraculous poem is a gift. And now I'll leave you with one more question. I'm going to come back to Forese Donati. When he offers up his penitential fasting, he sees it in relationship to the suffering of Christ. I can't help but ask, how many of you, the elders in the room, grew up hearing your mother say when you weren't feeling well, offer it up? Okay, good. You'll get this. So he's offering it up. So John Paul II writes, the creative character of suffering is possible for whoever suffers in union with Christ, just as the Apostle Paul bears his tribulations in Colossians 1:24, not only receives from Christ the strength already referred to, but also completes by his suffering what is lacking in Christ's afflictions. That's what Paul says. I make up in my suffering whatever may be lacking in Christ's afflictions. Charles Taylor suggests that this Christocentric sense of suffering remains a live option. He writes, on the basis of Christ's initiative, the incomprehensible healing power of his suffering, it becomes possible for human suffering, even of the most seemingly meaningless type, to become associated with Christ's act and to become a locus of renewed contact with God, an act which heals the world. The suffering is given a transformative effect by being offered to God. So in our secular age, can we, do we, how can we continue to understand suffering in this particularly Catholic sense? And if so, how might this understanding take form in our lives and in our literary art? For readers willing to engage questions like this and others, Dante's poem offers, as Cacciaguida says, living nourishment. The love that moves the sun and the other stars moved the poet to compose his Commedia, which is an act of love for us, his fellow pilgrims. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you all for those wonderfully rich papers. So much going on and such a variety of subjects. I always enjoy, picking out particular lines or observations when I listen to such rich papers. It's hard to take it all in, but just a couple of thoughts that occurred to me. I loved Catherine's highlighting of Dante's line, I saw, that wonderful sense of falling in love with beauty without wanting to possess it. I couldn't help but think of Winnie, Witty, Weechi. I came, I saw, I conquered. I had to have it. Whereas for Dante, he doesn't want to possess it. He is just an appreciator of it. So I thought that was really lovely. I really enjoyed a number of the things that Griffin mentioned in his observations. But I was particularly taken by his last comment that the Catholic imagination needs to become small. And of course, I immediately thought of that great Catholic writer, Herman Melville, who says in Moby Dick, as he's looking at the whale and all of its little parts and dissecting it and giving us a sense of the wonder that resides in every little piece of him, you don't enlarge your mind, you have to subtleize it in order to become brilliant. And I thought, yes, this is all roads lead to Melville, including Dante, so thank you for that. And then I can't decide which is my favorite comment that Paul made. One is, of course, Postcards from Purgatory. That's the name of my next book. So I can't wait to get back and start writing it. And then also, of course, the strenuous spa experience as a description of what purgatory is. And of course, that is such a brilliant observation that Flannery makes about the fact that purgatory is such a hopeful institution and something that Catholics really understand, but is probably difficult to convey to Protestant students. So God bless you in the work that you do. So we just have such a rich array of things to talk about, and we do have, despite the fact that we got a late start, we have some good time for conversation. So, any questions that anyone would like to pose to our panelists? Yes.
Do scholars think that the Commedia is strictly a literary artifact, or is there any evidence that Dante actually experienced vision?
You go, you're the Dantes.
Oh, so,
Give it a whirl.
Good question. So the question is, well, essentially, did it really happen, or was it just a literary artifice? Sorry, I'm blanking on the name, but the famous fiction is
Yes,
the idea.
Hollander.
Right, Hollander. That's it. So it says that the fiction of the Divine Comedy is that it's not a fiction.
It's not a fiction.
Right, but so it kind of sends you into this labyrinthine sense of questioning. It really comes down to the way that you read it. To me, there's no way that such a visionary poem could not be the fruit of at least something. In my view, a kind of lifetime of contemplative prayer. I think the way to look at it is similar to the Hebrew prophets. That is, that their visionary experiences arise from the tense societal conflicts that they observe. So there's no one else to turn to but God. So certainly Dante turns to God. I mean, there's this trend in Dante studies to de-theologize Dante, to talk about how, well, he actually stages himself as a master and he's kind of the controller behind the scenes, but that's completely at odds with the love that everybody's mentioned. I don't know, I mean, if you think of a lover, is it going to be a controlling or a receptive? I think Dante is much more receptive than he is controlling. So I think that's kind of the question. He's not trying to pull one over on us. Why would he?
And I must say, students are sensitive to that. They think, who does he think he is? I mean, there's one point in this Revelation parade where it's between Ezekiel and John. John's with me. It's like two biblical writers. The Peter Hawkins has an essay about that. But it's hard to teach too the old value or the virtue of magnanimity. He wants to be great, and I'm sorry, I'm going to bring Springsteen in here.
Don't be sorry.
But, there's an interview with Springsteen where he makes it. He's humble about it, but he's clear. I didn't just want to be good. I wanted to be great. I mean, he was shooting for the moon and stars, and that was it. And so was Dante, and so he lets it rip. And but he is. I think you're right. I mean, finally, it's always deferring to the mystery, to God, to love.
And Springsteen's most recent album, of course, is called Western
Western
Stars.
Stars.
So definitely just channeling Dante. So.
Can I have one thing?
Absolutely.
First of all, it calls to mind that, can you hear me? Yes, okay. The passage where it's revealed that this poem is a product of both heaven and earth. And there was definitely a sense among Dante's contemporaries. This was almost scripture. Really, really had a very high, it was revered as almost a form of revelation. And in all of those other stories that I recounted, of course this would make sense if you were a Zoroastrian in 4th century BC or whatever, but the very fact that the person had the vision meant it was true. Okay, Varaz was sent off there to find it out. They gave him a henbane and all kinds of stuff to have a vision. He came back and told him. So the actual visit proved it, and this was for Muhammad too. His people were always yelling, "Tell us what you're doing." So then he would have a vision, and they'd say, "Oh, okay." He went there and told us. So it's a different kind of sense of how you access reality, where the vision actually is honored as a legitimate path. I don't have any problem with that at all myself. In all of these stories, whether it's Dante or Contino or whoever, all these religions people keep looking outward. Why do we keep doing that? It's not just the fear of death. It's hope, and it's hope because there actually is something out there that is beckoning to us. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, my late brother said a wonderful thing. He said, this was when he was dying. He was writing notes, and he said, as gratitude is an echo of God's grace, hope is an echo of God's paying attention.
Other questions or observations you might like to make about any of the speakers? Yes.
A question for Catherine. Regarding the depiction of Satan as encased in ice
Yes.
in the center of hell, of course, it's traditional to depict hell as fire.
That's hot, I know.
Is Dante the first to use that image of Satan encased in ice?
Oh gosh, I'd have to say I don't know, because, I mean, do any of you?
No, but
We should
I
know.
think he is.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah,
terrific.
there's no
Yeah,
precedent to that. Generally, it's pretty hot.
The ice of ego.
Yeah, it's pretty hot down
Yes.
I'm reminded at the end of A Grief Observed by Lewis, as he's, thinking and reflecting on the death of his own wife, Joy, and finally coming to terms with it. He talks about having his own vision of her turning back to, he quotes, Beatrice turning back to contemplate God. And that is how he ends this book. And it reminds me of this idea, I think, Paul, you talked about it, redemptive suffering, and how ultimately there is no answer except love, and except turning back to God, and being, I think, Paul, you said, God's got this. We just need to submit to grace. And that's kind of one of the things that I think about. And I was at the University of Portland, and we would use A Grief Observed in a class on the theological dimensions of suffering and death for nursing students. And so, and they would read the book, and the last lines would be in Italian, and no student ever, went to look it up to figure out what it was. And so they were left with this empty, and that was always the way I would lead off the discussion about the book was, what are these last lines? Not a soul would get it. And then revealing to them, this is Dante's, the culmination of his entire journey. It's really, it's mind blowing, and yet, how do we get that idea? Because this idea of redemptive suffering ultimately is probably one of the greater challenges of our age. Especially
I think part of the reason we're maybe loath to talk about it is because it can never be presented to a sufferer in a glib way.
That's right.
Good Lord, after the Holocaust, okay. And, think of contemporary suffering. So it has that has to be the proviso that somehow, I don't know, I was talking to a woman who's doing a PhD here. She's looking at forgiveness and silence. I don't know, there's a kind of trust, but also a pastoral silence. You know what I mean? You want to avoid that glibness in the face of horrific suffering. And yet, there is a way in Christ for it all to somehow make sense. So, I'm thinking about this with the brothers Karamazov, which I also think of as the great Catholic novel, which is very funny because he hated Catholics. But, a little boy dies, a little kid dies at the end. You can't be glib about it. That's the worst pain a parent can feel, right? And yet Alyosha gives this little speech at the end where he's saying, somehow this is all going to come together. And we're always going to remember this little kid, and our hearts are breaking, and yet we see paradise. So, I don't know, maybe it's all in the tone. And anybody else want to
I would add just a brief comment about the form of the Divine Comedy, that it's a volume. He calls it towards the end, love binds the Divine Comedy in sol volume, something that it's got that language of turning. It's useful to remember too this idea of I think it's Julian of Norwich, but who says Does the story have a happy ending? No. Well, then the story's not over. But so it's that sense of recursion that happens in Divine Comedy where you have to, like Dante, I mean, full of tragedy. Most stories in the Divine Comedy end badly, including Francis of Assisi. He was abandoned by his order. But it's not the end of the story. And I think that's what Dante kind of keeps trying to say is that, you know, you should experience the worst, as Steve Millies and I were talking about this last night. And he was saying, it's gonna happen again. You know, the bad things that will happen again, but the story continues. I think that's important to remember for Dante.
Thank you. We have time for probably one more question. Yes, sir.
So there's this new television show about the Brady Bunch. It's on HGTV. And the first episode, I'm going to Dante. Anyway, in the first episode, they renovate the actual house in North Hollywood that you just saw the front of to be like the Brady Bunch house from the 70s. And everybody's like, wow, it's the house of my childhood. So you go in there and there's this whole like redone house. And I guess what came to me, and especially Griffin, when you were speaking today, you know, this idea of reform or reconstruction that you think Dante provides a way to like re-enrich the Catholic imagination. I was thinking, I was like, well, a good thing, like we didn't throw out those couches, you know, even though they're super kitsch now. So like, what would be the balance at Dante, from Dante's perspective, because he's able to renovate this Catholic vision, still using, you know, all of the tools of the tradition that you spoke of, the quadrivia, the trivium, and whatnot. Like, what's going to be the balance there of, you know, being appropriately impoverished, but appropriately engaged with like the fullness of tradition, right? So.
Oh, sure. So first let me say I don't know. But secondly, I mean, I guess I would, so I briefly taught the Catholic intellectual tradition, and I guess I'll say this, is that I think there's an impoverishment right now of a sense of a knowledge of the tradition, and I think that's kind of where we need to begin. I remember students would say, including non-Catholic students, but the Catholics would say, we had no idea that this tradition existed. You know, we do everything from the Gospel up to Pope Francis, but you introduce them to Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, right, and Flannery O'Connor, they don't know. But so they say things like, well, we hear our pastors and, you know, they never get into any of this. So there's also, I don't know, I think it's a huge problem, but there needs to be some recuperation of poets like Dante, because if you begin studying a poet like Dante, you have to go and learn Virgil, you have to go and read the Bible, you have to go and read medieval scholasticism. So it's the sense of, I guess also, and Paul, you can probably speak to this, but inviting students to be great, as you're saying, like Bruce Springsteen would do, like that you should be reading. Like I'm just looking at the window, and we were talking last night, you mentioned, I think you're a Gregory of Nyssa scholar, but Gregory's name is emblazoned, right? It's carved over there in Teresa of Avila. Like, these names need to be read and studied. But that's not to say you don't read Flannery O'Connor. You don't read people who are writing today. You have to do both at the same time, which is exactly what Dante was doing.
And it's so, Dante pervades everything. C.S. Lewis, and I was thinking as Catherine was speaking about St. Patrick's Purgatory, if anybody's read Seamus Heaney's, Station Island, just flew out of my Station Island. It's entirely dependent upon Dante. Micheal O'Sheill's new book that just came out, The Five Quintets, is based on Dante. Dante only had 3 levels, he needed 5. But if you don't know Dante, you can't read that very contemporary book that just came out. So we have to know Dante. It's the basis of our literature. So it's
And the 4 quartets too. I was so glad you ended with that line. And if you haven't heard Jeremy Irons read this, he has the most beautiful reading of the 4. He has the whole Eliot corpus, but his reading of the 4 quartets is just beautiful. Yeah, it's just beautiful.
Well, I'm afraid our time is up, but I want to thank you all for coming out today, and please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.